Here at the very beginning of this video, I would like you to pause. And if you're watching this video with other people, I would like you to explain to them, what is your picture of the ideal rest-filled day? Like if you could just have the perfect rest-filled day, what would that look like? Share with those around you what that picture would be. In our conversations, now think this through. In so many of the conversations that we have, when you're just making small talk, hey, how you doing? How many of our conversations go back to how busy you are? How many different things you got going on? At work, at school, with the kids. Oh, you'd never believe the kids' activities, driving around, taking them here, taking them there. Like so many of our conversations, when we're just catching up, we just seem to constantly go back to this persistent theme about busyness. Just how hectic and chaotic our lives are. Now, what does that say about us? What does that say about us that one of the first things that I have, or one of the first things I think about when I want to explain myself to other people is I want to explain how busy I am. Oftentimes we're defined by our busyness. And so many of us are chronically busy. We are restless people. Rest, the kind of rest that truly restores the body and the soul, is a habit. And it's a habit in which we are out of practice. Rest is the central idea, the central theme of Hebrews chapters 3 and 4. Now, let me just real quick summarize where we've been up to this point. Now, I told you that Hebrews is this comparative study, always wanting to remind us of who Jesus is. So in chapter 1, Hebrews compares Jesus to the prophets and to the angels. Both the prophets and the angels were representatives of God. And he says of Jesus that Jesus is greater than them, far superior than the prophets, far superior than the angels. In chapter 2, he reminds us that as big as Jesus is, Jesus also has come close. So he's our hero, he's our liberator, he's our high priest, but he also identifies with us. He identifies with us in our weakness, he identifies with us in our flesh, he identifies with us even in trials and temptations. Our hero and our liberator and our high priest knows who we are and identifies with us. That's the message of chapter 2. Chapters 3 and 4 pick up this theme of comparison once again. And now what he's going to do is he's going to compare Jesus first to Moses in Hebrews chapter 3 and then to Joshua in Hebrews chapter 4. And so here's what he says, starting in verse 3 of chapter 3. The author of Hebrews says this: Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses. Now let's just stop right there. Now, Moses, to the average Jewish person, Moses was on the Mount Rushmore, so to speak. I mean, he would have been right up there with Abraham and with Elijah. I mean, Moses was it. And so here he says in chapter 3, yeah, we already talked about the prophets, we already talked about the angels, but get this, Jesus is even worthy of greater honor than Moses himself. That's quite the statement. And he continues on, he says, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone. But God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, testifying to what would be said in the future. But Christ is faithful as a son over God's house. And we are his house if we hold on to our courage and the hope of which we boast. Now, what he's referring to here with all this house imagery is he's referring back to Numbers 12, verses 6 through 8. So I want to read that really quickly because I imagine you're not familiar necessarily with Numbers 12. And so he says we read in Numbers 12, when both of them step forward, he's talking about Aaron and Miriam here. He said, "Listen to my words. When a prophet of the Lord is among you, I will reveal myself to him in visions. I will speak to him in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Now in Numbers chapter 12, here's what's going on. The nation of Israel, they are wandering in the desert and they are complaining. They are not happy. And they're grumbling and complaining specifically against Moses. They're complaining against the leader that God had chosen for them. And so in Numbers 12, the people are being chastised for speaking badly about Moses, who is a leader among all of God's house. Now, house here refers to God's people, the household of God, the people of God. And so Hebrews picks up this theme in Hebrews chapter 3, and he says, listen, Moses, we know, was faithful as a servant in God's house. But Jesus is not a mere servant in God's house. Jesus is the son over God's house. Now, if the people were complaining against Moses in Numbers 12, and that was the big problem, is that they were grumbling and they were complaining and they weren't having faith in God, and they weren't having faith in God's chosen person to lead them out of Egypt. He's going to make the same point in Hebrews chapter 3. What he's going to say is, Jesus is a son over God's house. So don't make the same mistake that Israel made in the wilderness when they grumbled against Moses. Instead, trust Jesus, even in the midst of the deserts that you might find yourself in. And so in Hebrews chapter 3, the rest of Hebrews chapter 3, he picks up this theme, this image, this picture of wandering in the desert. Now, 10 times in Deuteronomy and Joshua, the people of Israel, and Joshua more specifically, are told to be strong and courageous. Do you know this passage? Especially in Joshua chapter 1. They're told to be strong and courageous as they are getting ready to enter into the promised land. And so given all of the imagery of chapter 3 and 4 of Hebrews, I don't think that Hebrews is accidentally saying in verse 6, but Christ is faithful as a son over God's house, and we are his house if we hold on to the courage and the hope of which we boast. We can almost hear Joshua 1 resounding in our ears. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. He's telling us the same thing here. When you're entering into the desert places, be strong and courageous. Maintain the hope in which you boast. The rest of chapter 3 and 4, the author of Hebrews uses this Exodus imagery to describe our own experiences following Jesus. But he uses the Exodus imagery that's actually found in Psalm 95. In Psalm 95, David, writing years and years and years after the Exodus events, David says that we also have a rest promised to us. And so he says, like for instance, in Hebrews 3, he says, today, verse 7, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion during the time of testing in the desert, where your fathers tested and tried me, and for 40 years saw what I did. That is why I was angry with that generation, and I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. He goes on in verse 15, he says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. What Hebrews is saying through the words of Psalm 95 is he's saying, don't repeat the mistakes of Israel. Israel saw what God had done. God had delivered them from slavery. God had rescued them from the hand of Pharaoh. God did amazing things in their presence. But as soon as they hit the desert, as soon as they hit that time of difficulty, they turned towards grumbling. They turned towards rebellion. And they ended up rebelling against God and against Moses. And so, again, through the words of Psalm 95, we're being warned, don't harden your hearts the same way that Israel hardened their hearts. Because when Israel hardened their hearts, what they lost was they lost the ability to enter into God's rest. We also have the promise of God's rest if we choose to respond with faithfulness instead of responding with rebellion. In chapter 4, he begins picking up on this same theme. He says, therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands. Let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. Let us be careful so that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. What Hebrews is saying throughout the rest of this chapter is he's saying you were designed for rest. And without getting into the details of the text, he talks about rest from the perspective of both the book of Genesis and also from the book of Joshua. And he says, Genesis tells us this. Genesis tells us that God's people were created for rest, that all people were created for rest. This has been woven into the fabric of creation. What we learn from Joshua is we learn that the rest that Joshua was able to offer to the people of Israel was incomplete. It was insufficient. And if you read the story of Joshua, you know that that's true. The people of Israel, even though they entered into the promised land, they still didn't experience perfect rest. And so what Hebrews notices is there's this principle of rest that's bigger than just one day of the week, and it's bigger than just one place. We were made for rest. And so there's just a few things that I want you to keep in mind as we close out chapter 4 about rest. The first thing is simply this. I want you to know that you were designed for rest. You were designed for rest. And by rest, what I mean is physical rest, certainly, but also spiritual rest. God did not intend us to be restless people. Part of the implications of the gospel is that God has promised to us rest, and this rest is a part of the way that we're designed. We're designed not to be automatons, but we are designed for proper and appropriate rest, physical and spiritual rest. The other thing that I want you to know is ultimately, true rest is only found in Jesus. Augustine said years ago that you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. You have made us for you, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And really the story of our culture, the story of our history, really, is a story of people trying to find their rest in some place other than in Jesus. What Augustine reminds us of, and what Hebrews reminds us of ultimately, is true rest, the rest that we're really longing for, a rest that is both physical and spiritual, can only be found in Jesus Christ. The third thing that Hebrews reminds us of is that rest is both a present reality and it's a future hope. It's a present reality and it's a future hope. He says in chapter 4, verse 11, he says, "Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will fall by following their example of disobedience." So one of the ideas that we get from Hebrews chapter 4 is to come to Jesus is to experience rest. But we also live in anticipation, in hopeful anticipation of a greater rest yet to come. So the rest for us is both a present and a future reality. Here's the big idea. In Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, the author of Hebrews is talking to a group of people. They're struggling in the desert. They're just like Israel, feeling distant and removed from God, weary in their spiritual life and weary in their physical lives. And in those desert places, the temptation is, again, to fall away, to rebel, and to revolt against God. What he wants to tell them and what he wants to tell us today is that if we will only persevere, we will experience true and lasting rest. And that true and lasting rest is a present reality for us in our lives as we follow Jesus, even as we wait for the future, more perfect rest. Now, as we close out this session, I want to go back real quick to a passage that I kind of skipped over in chapter 3. It says this. In the middle of chapter 3, verse 12, it says, "See to it, brothers, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We have come to share in Christ if we hold firmly till the end the confidence that we had at first. So I want you to reflect on two things. The first thing that I want you to reflect on is, what are the things in your life right now that are keeping you from experiencing the true and lasting rest that we're offered in Jesus? What are those things that are getting in the way? And what are maybe some strategies that we can employ to really embrace and take hold of this rest that Christ has offered to us? The second thing that I want you to reflect on is simply this. Hebrews reminds us that we're not in this desert alone. We're not trying to endure this time of trial and testing alone. He says, see to it, brothers, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living Lord. There's a community aspect to endurance. What he's challenging us to do is to encourage one another and to do it urgently, to do it today, as long as we have the opportunity. Encourage each other. You know, sometimes encouragement, we think of encouragement as just kind of a hug on the shoulder. And sometimes that's the shape that encouragement takes, but sometimes encouragement needs to be a kick in the rear, because we see people making choices to rebel and to reject God and to wander away. And it's a part of our obligation within the community of believers to encourage one another so that we don't drift away while we're in the desert. So what I'd like you to spend some time thinking about is, who are those people in your life that need your encouragement? Or maybe you are the person that needs the encouragement. Maybe you need to surround yourself with a community of faith that can lift you up, that can encourage you during this dry time in your relationship with Christ.